First, Mr. President, I want to thank our leader and our assistant leader for their great leadership and for their eloquence here on the floor today, and for correctly stating what the issue is. It's not rules, it's justice. And I'm going to speak about that myself. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Gregory Shanahan and Lemmy Telehoun of my staff be granted floor privileges for the duration of today's proceedings.
Without objection.
Mr. President, 50 years ago today, President Lyndon Johnson came before Congress and spoke these bold words. This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. Lyndon Johnson, as we all know, was born and raised amidst stark poverty in Texas Hill Country, coming of age during the Great Depression. From hard personal experience, he understood how poor schools, empty stomachs, and bad health make a mockery of America's promise of equal opportunity for all. When President Johnson delivered that historic State of the Union address, our nation was enjoying unprecedented post-war prosperity. We had become, in John Kenneth Galbraith's famous words, the affluent society. However, in the midst of this nation of prosperity and plenty, there was also, quote, the other America, as author Michael Harrington called it. Fully 1/5 of our population trapped in poverty. Across Appalachia, in urban ghettos, in large swaths of rural America, millions of American children were being raised in shacks and slums, going to bed hungry, attending grossly substandard schools. Worse, experts describe this poverty as intractable. Experts warn that despite the nation's overall prosperity, poverty was growing more widespread because, as one study put it, the poor were, quote, not part of the economic structure. A then report by the President's Council of Economic Advisors asserted that, quote, future economic growth alone will provide relatively few escapes from poverty, end quote. Economic growth alone, they said, will not solve the issue of poverty. Of course, I must add, it's very much the same today, isn't it, Mr. President? Economic growth alone will provide few escapes from poverty for people today if 95% of income gains are going to the top 1%. And if the rewards of productivity gains go to shareholders and not to the workers. So it was in this context that President Johnson, keep in mind less than 2 months assuming the office, after he assumed the office after the terrible assassination of President Kennedy, it was in this context that he summoned the nation so that the unconditional war on poverty could be waged. For LBJ, this was both an economic challenge and a profound moral challenge. It was about doing justice. In his speech to Congress, he said, very often, a lack of jobs and money is not the cause of poverty, but the symptom. The cause may lie deeper in our failure to give our fellow citizens a fair chance to develop their own capacities, in a lack of education and training, in a lack of medical care and housing, in a lack of decent communities in which to live and bring up their children. President Johnson continued, our chief weapons will be better schools and better health and better homes and better training and better job opportunities to help more Americans, especially young Americans, to escape from squalor and misery and unemployment rolls where other citizens help to carry them. Mr. President, in the months that followed this State of the Union address, President Johnson proposed specific programs to attack poverty and inequality, and he articulated his broader vision for what he called a great society. There's no better place to appreciate the boldness and accomplishment of this era than at the Lyndon B. Johnson's Library and Museum in Austin, Texas. My favorite part is a room, and I've been there several times, commemorating the Great Society, with plaques and pens, signing pens, all along the wall, listing the incredible array of legislation that President Johnson had passed into law. Listen to these. The Great Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Job Corps, VISTA, Upward Bound, the Food Stamp Program, Legal Services for the Poor, the Community Action Program, Community Health Centers, Head Start, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, Public Broadcasting, the National Mass Transportation Act, the Cigarette Labeling Act, the Clean Air Act, the Wilderness Act. Mr. President, it takes your breath away to think about all that was done. These great society programs have defined the modern United States of America as a compassionate, inclusive society, a genuine opportunity society where everyone can contribute their talents and abilities. Last month, on December the 4th, in his landmark speech on inequality, President Obama noted that these and other initiatives have helped to reduce the poverty rate by 40% since the 1960s. Have helped reduce the poverty rate by 40% since the 1960s. President Obama said, quote, "These endeavors didn't just make us a better country, they reaffirmed that we are a great country." However, Mr. President, on this 50th anniversary of President Johnson's great address to Congress, I must acknowledge that there are some who profoundly disagree with this assessment on the war on poverty and the Great Society. They insist it was a great failure. Indeed, I have heard this claim from many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle since I first came to Congress in 1975. This supposed, quote, failure of the war on poverty, this failure of the Great Society, has indeed become almost an article of faith and dogma among conservatives. It is truly the triumph of belief over reality. As President Reagan said on May 9th, 1983, quote, "The great expansion of government programs that took place under the aegis of the Great Society coincided with an end to economic progress for America's poor people." Wow, that's quite an assertion by President Reagan. So, Mr. President, allow me on this 50th anniversary to take a few minutes to point out many of the, quote, failures of the war on poverty and the Great Society. Perhaps a good place to start is by pointing out the, quote, failure of Medicare. At the bill signing ceremony for the Social Security Amendments Act on July 30th of 1965, President Johnson enrolled former President Harry Truman as the first Medicare beneficiary and presented him with the first Medicare card. You know, these days we talk about life after 65 as the golden years. Well, I'll tell you, life after 65 used to be the nightmare years, with tens of millions of Americans unable to afford even basic medical care, condemned to live out their senior years in the misery of untreated or poorly treated illnesses. In 1959, the poverty rate among older Americans was 35%. Since the Great Society program started, poverty rate among seniors has fallen by nearly 2/3. What a failure. What a failure. And Medicare is especially personal to me I remember my father, who was then in his late 70s, had never had access to any regular health care in his life. My father only had a sixth grade education. Worked in coal mines most of his life. Suffered from what they then called coal miner's lung. They always called it coal miner's lung. And he would get sick all the time, and if it weren't for the compassion and the generosity of the Sisters of Mercy, who would take care of him when he got sick and nurse him back to health, I don't know what would have happened to him. But I can remember coming home from the military on military leave, late 1965, and my father had his Medicare card. And for the first time in his life, and now he was approaching almost 80 years of age, for the first time in his life, he could go see a doctor. He could go see a doctor without begging, without taking charity. It gave him the dignity and the security of knowing that he could see a doctor if he needed to. The Great Society also gave birth to community health centers, as long as I'm talking about health care. Community health centers to provide essential medical care to the poor. The first two community health centers were opened in 1964, one in Boston, Massachusetts, and one in rural Mississippi. This model of providing basic health services to the uninsured and underserved was an enormous success. Listen to this. From that modest beginning of two in 1964, community health centers have expanded to include more than 1,200 community health centers in more than 9,000 locations, serving more than 22 million patients annually. What a failure. What a failure. Well, I guess another failure of the Great Society was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We call it ESEA. You know, since Brown versus Board of Education, decision by the Supreme Court in the mid-50s, Americans acknowledged that we had two school systems, one for the middle class and the well-off, and a grossly inferior one for the poor. ESEA said that all children, regardless of their background and their circumstances of birth, can learn, and the federal government will provide resources to help create equity among our schools. Now, educating children of poverty will always be challenging. We still have large achievement gaps that still persist. But Title I assistance to America's neediest schools has made a dramatic difference for the good of millions of low-income children. If it's been such a great failure, I would ask any senator who wants to repeal Title I and defund it, please step forward. Speak up here on the Senate floor. Say that you want to do away with Title I and defund it. I'll bet I don't get any takers. And what about the failure of the Higher Education Act? In 1965, it was rare for young people from disadvantaged and low-income backgrounds to go to college. So President Johnson and Congress passed the Higher Education Act, creating need-based grants and loans with reduced interest rates. Today, Pell Grants, created in a later version of the Higher Education Act, help more than 9 million low-income students gain access to higher education. The Higher Education Act has swung open the doors to college for countless Americans, creating new opportunities and access to the American dream. Again, I suppose some see this as another failure, another government handout that prevents people from standing on their own 2 feet. Well, you can decide for yourself if vastly expanding access to higher education constitutes a failure. But before you do, talk to a lower income student striving, say, to become a doctor. the first in her family to go to college, thanks to the TRIO program, Upward Bound, thanks to Pell Grants, thanks to low-interest college loans. Ask her if she feels like she's an undeserving taker, unwilling to stand on her own 2 feet. In August of 1964, again, just a few months after declaring the war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Food Stamp Act. Prior to that act, hunger and malnutrition were shockingly widespread in America, especially in rural areas and in our urban ghettos. Now today, we still have millions of food insecure people in America. But thanks to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the new name for the food stamp program, abject hunger in America is rare. Tens of millions of Americans, more than half of them children, are insured a basic nutritional minimum. Is this another failure? Food stamps? Well, apparently many members of this body think so. In June of 2012, 33 Republican senators voted to block grant the food stamp program and slash the funding by over $300 billion over 10 years. I asked senators who voted for those cuts, have you ever talked to a first grader who was finally able to concentrate in class because she had a breakfast paid for by food stamps? Have you asked her whether she'd prefer to tough it out without a meal to start the day? Mr. President, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson's Office of Economic Opportunity created 269 local legal services offices across the country, providing legal assistance to low-income Americans. This later evolved into the Legal Services Corporation. And as a proud former legal aid lawyer myself, I know firsthand what a difference this can make in so many circumstances. A struggling family facing foreclosure, a battered woman trying to leave an abusive marriage, a senior citizen victimized by a financial scam. I know that without access to an attorney, the poor are often powerless against the injustices that they suffer. Is the dedicated work of legal aid attorneys a failure? I vigorously disagree. And the American Bar Association vigorously disagrees. It strongly supports legal services. You know, every federal judge and Supreme Court justice, in their oath of office, swears to, quote, administer justice without respect to persons, and to do equal right to the poor and to the rich. To do equal right to the poor and to the rich. Well, it's legal services and legal services lawyers who help to translate that ideal into a reality for poor people in courtrooms all over America. Well, Mr. President, our frontline soldiers in the war on poverty are the dedicated professionals and volunteers in community action agencies, another Great Society program. These are funded by the Federal Community Services Block Grant. In 2012, these locally driven agencies served nearly 19 million low-income Americans, including more than 5 million children, more than 2 million people with disabilities, and 2.5 million seniors, served by community action agencies. These agencies equip people with skills to return to work. They provide food, clothing, other emergency assistance. They administer Head Start programs, other preschool programs, and do a lot more. So I guess you can decide if the community action program and community action agencies and the community services block grant has been a failure. But before you do, Drop in on a community action agency in your state. See for yourself the amazing work they do in relieving poverty and helping people to escape it. Speak to members of a local community action agency board. You'll find that they're local business people, bankers, lawyers, as well as people who receive the services. They will tell you how these agencies do so much with so little, performing indispensable services in their communities. Talk to them. Well, Mr. President, I could spend hours citing so many other great society initiatives. But let me mention just one more. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Prior to that act, African Americans faced open, legalized discrimination and segregation. We had our own American version of apartheid. In many parts of our country, including right here in Washington, D.C., African Americans could not eat at the same lunch counter with whites. They could not use the same bathrooms, the same swimming pools, the same water fountains. They literally were consigned to the back of the bus. Well, because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, those Jim Crow laws and practices were ended in the United States of America. It became illegal to discriminate based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. Well, I guess some apparently call that a failure. One of the great society's many, quote, failures. Well, you can decide for yourself whether America is better off today, whether we're better as a society, stronger as a nation, because we did away with segregation. You decide that. President Reagan, in his State of the Union address in 1988, listen to this. President Reagan, in his State of the Union address in 1988, said that the Great Society, quote, declared war on poverty and poverty won, end quote. One of President Reagan's catchy one-liners. But with all due respect to President Reagan, it simply is not historically accurate. Not even close. From the time President Johnson took office in 1963 until 1970, as the full impact of the Great Society programs began to be felt, the number of Americans living below the poverty line dropped from 22.2% down to 12.6%, almost cut it in half. The poverty rate for African Americans fell from 55% in 1960 to 27% in 1968. The poverty rate among the elderly, as I said earlier, fell by over 2/3. Now, the great shame is that this progress, this war on poverty of the Great Society was cut short. The war on poverty gave way to the war in Vietnam. And then it gave way in retrenchment later on, in later administrations, which cared less about giving a hand up to the poor, than about giving handouts to the rich in the form of giant tax breaks and other advantages. What was started as a percolate-up economy under the Great Society became a trickle-down economic society under later administrations. So, Mr. President, on this 50th anniversary of President Johnson's great address to Congress, let me state unequivocally and factually, historically factually, the Great Society has been an historic success. However, I must note that 50 years later, our nation confronts a new set of economic challenges, societal challenges, challenges that are every bit as dangerous to our democracy, every bit as daunting and intractable as those confronted by President Johnson and the Congresses of his time. Our economy is still struggling to recover from the Great Recession. The sluggish recovery has left us with chronic unemployment and a middle class in crisis. Social mobility, the ability to work your way up the economic ladder, is now lower in the United States than in Europe. For the vast majority of American workers, incomes have been stagnant for decades. But the rich have grown fabulously richer. Think about this. Since the official end of the Great Recession in 2009, 95% of income gains in the U.S. have gone to the wealthiest 1% in the last 5 years. 95% of income gains have gone to the wealthiest 1%. So, Mr. President, unlike in President Johnson's day, today it's not only the poor who are at risk, our great middle class is endangered. Millions of formerly middle-class Americans have lost their jobs, their homes, their savings, their hopes for a decent retirement. For too many of our citizens, the American dream has become hopelessly out of reach. This is the crisis. This is the challenge of our day. And are we rising to meet this challenge as previous generations of Americans have done? No. I'm afraid we are not. Here inside the Washington bubble, too many of our political leaders have persuaded themselves that the biggest issue of the day is the budget deficit, ignoring chronic unemployment and a struggling economy. This 113th Congress and the previous Congress have pursued policies of relentless austerity, slashing budgets, defunding research and investment, destroying jobs, and even refusing to extend federal unemployment benefits for the long-term jobless, 1.3 million of whom lost their last lifeline of support just 3 days after Christmas. So I am disturbed, Mr. President, by an apparent shift of attitude by many elected leaders toward the ordinary people who do the hard day in and day out work that makes our country strong. I said it before, I say it again, we're seeing an attitude of harshness. You know, we used to agree that if you worked hard and played by the rules, you should be able to earn enough to support your family, keep a roof over your head, put some money away for a rainy day, have a secure retirement. We used to agree that if you lose your job through no fault of your own, especially at a time of chronic unemployment, you should have some support while you're looking for new work. We used to agree on both sides of the aisle that no child in this country should go to bed hungry at night. But in recent years, these fundamental principles and values and agreements have come under attack in our public discourse. For instance, recently on a Sunday talk show, the junior senator from Kentucky said it would be, quote, a disservice to the long-term jobless to extend federal unemployment insurance. I have his exact words right here. Senator Paul said this: when you allow people to be on unemployment insurance for 99 weeks, you're causing them to become part of this perpetual unemployed group in our economy. And while it seems good, it actually does a disservice to the people you're trying to help. When there's 3 people looking for every job, when in some areas, some states, unemployment is even worse than that, you cut off their long-term unemployment, where are they going to get a job? And maybe what the senator doesn't understand is that before you can even get unemployment benefits, you have to be actively looking for work. A disservice? I guess our new attitude is tough luck, you're on your own. If you struggle, even if you face insurmountable challenges, well, it's your own fault, tough luck, you're on your own. If you're a kid born into poverty, or a single parent working for minimum wage, struggling to pay the bills and put food on the table, tough luck. You're on your own. If you're a 55-year-old worker who has lost her job due to outsourcing or technological change, tough luck. You're on your own. If you're a person with a significant disability, struggling to find work and independence and dignity, tough luck. You're on your own. Mr. President, there's a harshness among too many in powerful positions toward those Americans who have tough lives, who are ill-educated or marginally employed, or who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. A harshness among too many people in powerful positions toward these